Newsmaker Sunday with Fox 10's John Hook.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker Sunday. So you thought that the mayor of Phoenix and the city council run the city of Phoenix? We've got today on the program the guy who actually runs the city of Phoenix in really a city manager form of government, Ed Zuercher, who's been on the job for a year and a half. He's our guest this week on Newsmaker Sunday, and the first time you've been on the program, I believe.
That's right. Thanks for having me. I appreciate
You're
the
welcome.
invitation.
There's so much going on, and you've been on the job 18 months.
Right.
I want to dive right in. Let's show tape number 2, this flight path issue that we've been talking about. Flights going in and out of Phoenix, really departing is the big one to the west. Roughly, let's see, what would it have been? September 18th, 2014. People woke up and planes were flying over their house and they're like, what the heck is going on?
Exactly. Changes
happened. When did you first learn about it?
I first learned about it, John, about a week before the September 18th rollout date. But we're here now today because the city has done an extensive investigation to find out how long before that did other people know about it.
And it looks like about 2.5 years.
From the first city employee being aware of what the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, was doing, was about 2 years before that. And over that series of 2 years, there were about 5 other employees for a total of 6 who were engaged in one way or another in hearing from what was going on by the FAA.
The thing that I think, a lot of residents torqued off that it happened, but then they're saying, what are we paying these people at the city for if they're not going to watch our back?
Right.
So you had 6 aviation employees who knew about this. Did they ever run it up the flagpole to anybody in the chain of command who could maybe put the brakes on this?
No, and that's really the issue. So what happened this week was we had a report completed by an outside law firm because we had heard bits and pieces over the time since September that city employees may have known something before. And so the firm did an extensive review, and they detail in a report, and it's available at skyharbor.com, I'm sure linked on your website too, what happened, who knew what, when. And so that's an important timeline because we committed to the residents that we would be open and transparent about what the city knew. But I think what's important here is what the city knows and doesn't know is important, but what's really critical is what the FAA does and what the FAA says, because they control the flight paths. They alone are the ones who do the flight paths. We have responsibilities, and this report, which we'll talk about more, is troubling, and I've addressed it, but really it's also the FAA that is the biggest player in this.
Well, they were not, in your view, the FAA, above board in what they were trying to do. Do you believe they tried to contact and run this through lower level aviation employees to try to fly, literally, under the radar?
That's a great analogy for it, and actually the report talks about that a little bit. And I'll just read you one piece out of here. The report says, the FAA, interestingly, did not directly contact any senior member of the aviation department prior to September 2014. Instead, for reasons unknown, the FAA chose to make a sole point of contact at the lowest levels of the aviation department.
You believe by design?
I think so, and the author of the report believes so. I believe so. It doesn't excuse the lack of communication from city staff. I want to make that clear. I'm not here to make excuses for city staff, but it's really important in all this not to lose sight of the fact that the FAA had a significant role in this, in how it happened, and they were the only ones who are able to make flight path changes.
Okay, so let's go back to the city culpability in terms of the 6 people involved. The highest level person, she's probably somebody making $100,000 to $150,000 a year in that job.
That's right range.
I got to tell you, Ed, in our world, if we messed up that badly and then lied about it or deceived superiors about what they knew and when, we'd be fired.
Sure, but let me make an important distinction here. There's no accusation in this report, and I don't believe that Tammy Fisher, who you're referring to, lied. In fact, in December, when we had a big public meeting about this with the City Council, she laid out the timeline, and she has said the aviation department knew, and she knew in August and September of 2013, and she apologized for that and accepted responsibility for that.
Okay. Did anybody else?
This isn't an example of
Did anybody
lying.
else lie to you about this?
I think there was there was a lack of forthcoming from some of the lower level positions, and that's what the discipline is about. that we didn't get the full story until much later. We had to bring in the investigators to get the full story of it. But at the top levels, we did not have, I don't believe, we did not have people lying about it. That is a serious thing. That's not what this is about.
Okay, you've been with the city for 22 years.
Yes.
Step back for a minute. You've seen this from every level. You started as an intern, as you were telling me before at City Hall. What do you think the breakdown was? Why would 6 people whose job it is to really be immersed in this kind of thing, why would they not tell anybody about it?
Yeah, well, that's really the question, isn't it? That we are sort of frustrated by and disappointed by. That's what I hear coming from the public, and I understand that. I think it's really instructive to us, and in fact, I'm going to use this as instruction for all the department heads in the city. All the executives in the city have been required to read this report because it gets exactly that question you asked, which is exactly the right one. How can this happen? And I think what happened here was the regulating agency and the regulated agency, which would be the city, there was a relationship that was not appropriately distant, that there was too much familiarity and comfort, too much trust without verification, and too much taking them at their word. We should not do that. That's not our role, to be trusting of that outside agency. We can be respectful, but we need to push back. We need to ask questions.
Okay.
That didn't happen.
That's very interesting. So in other words, if they were talking to lower level staff with aviation, the FAA was kind of telling them casually, hey, this is no big deal. We do this all the time. And people who've built relationships,
Right.
hey, we get burned on this exact same thing sometimes.
Sure.
You build relationships with sources, and sometimes you give them too much. You give them too much trust, and you can get led down a dangerous path doing that.
Yeah.
So you're saying that those relationships maybe led to some of this, where when they say, oh, it's not going to be a big deal, don't, you know, you will not notice a difference.
Yeah.
People took them at their word.
And so we need to be making sure that we are keeping an appropriate professional distance there and not being so linked together. In fact, we had one of the employees in this report was saying, hey, you guys, I know you get to do whatever you want, so I can't really tell you what to do. And
right,
while that
I read that quote.
While that may be true.
Saying that to the FAA.
Saying that to the FAA.
Who am I to challenge the federal government?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That may be factually true that, yes, the FAA does make the ultimate decision. That doesn't absolve us from the responsibility to push back and ask questions and check and double check and talk about it.
We'll circle back on this,
Sure.
but it is worth talking about. Mark Martinez did a real nice job kind of laying this out and where we stand right now. This is Mark Martinez's story from this past week.
It's not something we wanted to do, but it's something that we had to do.
Phoenix Mayor Greg Stanton explaining why the city took the unusual step of suing the FAA. He says they were left with no choice after months of trying to resolve the noise issue.
We were backed into a corner, and we had to show that we will advocate for the residents of Phoenix. And so today was a necessary step in order to be the best advocates we could for the people of Phoenix.
Signs like these started popping up in historic Phoenix neighborhoods after the FAA changed the flight path without notice 8 months ago. People living here say it's had an effect on their quality of life.
I have not been able to sleep or get full sleep. Constant interruptions throughout the middle of the night.
Residents flooded Sky Harbor with thousands of noise complaints since the FAA made those changes to the flight path last September as part of its nationwide Next Gen program designed to save fuel and make travel more efficient.
They're setting a very bad precedent by how they've acted here in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is historic Phoenix. To preserve that, it's important.
And if you're just joining us, Ed Zuercher is the Phoenix City Manager, and it was 6 employees with the aviation department whose job it was to kind of monitor this kind of thing that probably dropped the ball on this. Let me ask you about discipline for these folks. How far can you talk about that? Again, this is real dereliction of duty. For whatever reason it happened, it happened. They didn't run it up the chain of command. What happens to those people now?
It's a failure of judgment. It's a failure of communication. So 2 of the 6 are no longer with the city. So I have no
So they'd
authority.
already retired
They
from
had
the city?
Retired or left for other reasons, got another job. So we're left with 4. 3 employees at lower levels in the organization have specific civil service rights that that I can't really comment specifically on what's going on with them, other than to say there's a written reprimand, there's demotions, there's suspensions.
Is firing not an option, or is this not a fireable offense in your view?
In my judgment, given the circumstances, given the report and what happened, this was not a fireable offense. It didn't fall within that sort of guideline in our personnel system. For the acting aviation director, Tammy Fisher, she does not have those same civil service protections and works
Why is
for
that?
me. At a certain level in our organization,
She's
you
at a
don't have
management
civil
level.
service. At
She's
an
at a
executive level,
okay.
right.
Okay.
And so Ms. Fisher has been suspended without pay for a week, and she has been demoted back into an assistant director job. And I've brought a deputy city manager from City Hall to be the aviation director, and we're currently in a national recruitment for a permanent aviation director at Sky
So
Harbor.
she really does pay the piper on this, or can she mess around with vacation time
No.
or any accrued time to try to soften the blow?
No, it is a week without pay, plus a demotion comes with a 5% reduction in pay. So it's a financial.
She gets a pay cut because of this.
Right.
Have you
Very
talked?
serious.
Have you talked to her?
I have.
Can you at least tell me the tenor of that conversation?
She, and I will say this, Tammy has been up front throughout.
Okay, so she is not one of the ones who was deceptive.
She was not deceptive.
Okay, that's
in my
good
view.
to get out there.
In front of the public and in council meetings, admitted the misses made by management and the length of time and those things. She's a professional. She accepted it. She's very regretful and remorseful that she missed it in everything that was going on. But she understands, and she's willing to take her punishment and move forward.
Now, we're suing the FAA, as we just showed in that story. The question I have, Ed, is however the ball was dropped, the fact that the ball was dropped by the city, can the FAA say, well, listen, we did everything we needed to do. We didn't do anything wrong. If the city doesn't raise the issue, we're not on the hook for this. We're just going to keep the flight path as it is.
Yeah.
That can be their defense.
That's a great question, and also a great summation of what I'm expecting will be the FAA's point of view on this. But I would disagree with it, and I find that to be frustrating because I don't think that they did do what they were supposed to do. You know, it would be the equivalent of me talking to the security guard outside of Channel 10, asking them a question, getting an answer, and then going back and saying, well, the Channel 10 said it was okay, right?
Not to disparage our security guards,
absolutely in
who
no
are
way,
very, very bright.
or to disparage our frontline employees who work very hard. But there's an appropriate level of communication.
Right.
And the FAA never directly spoke to our senior executive leadership. The very people who,
Does
by
that
the way,
normally happen,
no.
talking to other cities? Do other
Well,
cities, what's their experience?
It's been all over the place. Some cities that has happened, and in others they're experiencing what we're experiencing, and so we're sort of a cautionary tale to others as well about, you know, make sure that you hold the FAA to account.
One more thing on this, and then we'll move on. The fact that they dropped the ball, not only do we have the noise problem now in the city, in the historic districts, and residents affected, but now we're going to have to pay for a lawsuit to undo it.
That's
that
right.
mistake.
That's right. We have filed
This
a
is
lawsuit.
costing you guys money, costing the taxpayers money.
As your clip said with Mayor Stanton, we have filed a lawsuit in the district court in the District of Columbia, and that is underway. We worked as long and hard as we could with the FAA to try and get some resolution.
Right.
We met with them to come up with something that didn't have to be done through a lawsuit, and they just wouldn't budge. They would not move in a way that would satisfy our residents that they had been heard, and so we were left with no choice but to file a lawsuit.
Okay. Ed Zuercher is the Phoenix city manager, the guy who runs the city in a city manager form of government. The buck really stops with him. When we come back, we're going to talk about police and fire pension issues that some say are driving this city toward insolvency if we don't get a handle on it. Back in a minute with City Manager Ed Zuercher, City of Phoenix. Back on Newsmaker Sunday with Phoenix City Manager Ed Zuercher. He's been with the city for 22 years, 18 months on the job as city manager. You oversee how many people now?
We have about 14,500 employees at the city.
Is it safe to say that the biggest challenge facing this city right now is how to deal with pension and retirement costs that are a driver of budgets, that you've got to try to get a handle on this?
Well, I think, you know, as a big city, we have lots of challenges. Transportation is one, and that's something that's being addressed this fall. But yes, in terms of budgetary challenges, financial, pension issues are a big driver of what we have to work on in the next 12 months as we look towards the budget that begins in 2016.
2016, you're looking at a $31 to $58 million budget. Do
That's
you have
right.
a handle on what that number might be more accurately?
We won't until we get farther into the year and actually start understanding what our expenses are going to be 12 months from now.
How about the revenue side? Has it improved?
The revenue side is improving. Statewide, it's really good news. The tourism industry has come back fairly strong, and retail's coming back. There's a lot of attention being paid on the economy, on producing jobs outside of the real estate sector. I think that's paying off. So we're seeing, 3.5% to 5% growth in sales taxes, which is our largest source of revenue. And so that's encouraging news compared to previous years when it was actually declining.
Prop 487 failed.
Yes.
Prop 487 was an attempt to rein in city workers' pensions and benefits, correct?
That's right.
And that really dealt with city workers, not
Civilians.
the public safety folks, police and fire. That's
right.
separate.
That's right.
That's really under the purview of the state. That can't be touched,
That's
right?
correct.
There are people within fire, Mr. Jeffries for one, there are others who have really come to the awakening that if they don't get a handle on this, it's going to foul up their situation. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so. The civilian workers in the city are under a city pension system. It's had several rounds of reform, and there's another one on the ballot this fall that total about $800 million over 20 years.
And that's nice, but that's not the big number.
That's not the big number. The real issue for us right now is the public safety pension, as you mentioned, which is a state-administered system. And that needs significant reform because that's really driving the majority of that deficit you mentioned. About 40 million of that is coming from the public safety pension increase.
40 million of the maybe 60
50,
million
yeah,
or 58
right,
million.
yeah.
Okay, now just to let people know and understand how this works, you are required by statute to make payments from the city to that state fund.
That's correct.
No wiggle room. You can't say, hey, we're in a dire fiscal situation, we can't do it.
That's right. And when
That's
people,
what Chicago did.
That's
That's
right.
what Detroit did.
That's exactly right, John. When people compare our situation to Illinois or Detroit, it's not apples to apples because in those cases, those organizations stopped making pension payments altogether.
How did they do that?
They don't have the same constitutional protections, I would assume. The charter of the city and the state require a minimum contribution, and we've always made that. But this is now about the performance of the stock market over the last 10 years,
Right.
and the growth and benefits that are all wrapped into an increase in pension costs, and the pension reform that was overturned by the Supreme Court is actually a really big hit in that.
Let me ask you quickly. The city's required contribution to the state retirement system for public safety employees, that is police and fire, just so we know what we're talking about, will jump to $197 million by 2020, up from $116 million this year. Back in 2011, it was only $70 million.
Right.
What has happened, Ed?
Right. So I think it's a combination of several things. One is the structure of the fund. It's rather technical, but there's some limitations to how much good performance in the stock market can actually benefit the fund. There's also,
Why would that be?
It's the way the fund is allocated. The profits of the stock market are allocated within the fund. They actually don't all go to paying off the.
Is it because of tax
debt.
reasons?
No, it's
Okay.
it's the statutorily some of it goes to giving cost of living increases instead of to paying down the debt that the fund has. So there's like a governor on the engine of the fund. There's also some things about benefits over the last 10 years that are part of it. And then the reform that the state tried in 2011 was overturned in court, and so we have to go back in time and pay back people who are affected by that act. All those things together have led to this big run-up in costs that we're now faced with.
What's the impact on folks here in the city of Phoenix? Because I know water rates have gone up. You've added on a $1.50 per water bill, right?
Well, water rates themselves have not gone up in 4 years. There is the $1.50 city services tax that was added to the bill last year
For this.
to balance the budget, which is partly driven by,
Okay.
yes. This
What's the
issue.
answer here? You've been at this a long
Yeah.
time. What is the answer?
I think the answer is pension reform that keeps in mind the constitutional protections that are in place. Whether people like it or not, the state constitution does not allow impacts to existing people in the pension system. So moving forward, there has to be reform. And the legislature is the one who's in charge of that. You mentioned Brian Jeffries, the firefighters. They do have a proposal that they're working on with the state legislature. I'm very encouraged by that movement, that there's dialogue going on to work at the state level to change the pension system to be more affordable.
One more thing. Is it safe to say, and this has always been my position on this, it's not fair to upend people who signed in for a certain deal to change it on them. It's not fair. But can you just say, okay, from this date forward with new employees, it's going to be a different deal.
Yeah.
You're going to have to contribute more to your own retirement. We're going to have to do a combination to try to get this under control over the long haul. Is that kind of where we're going?
Yeah, I think you got it exactly right. That was the problem with 487 that you mentioned. 487 tried to do things to people in the middle of their time. And that was the problem that the state Supreme Court had with the legislative changes from 2011.
Right.
And so these next changes, we think, have to keep in mind that constitutional provision.
That you made promises.
You make promises, you have to keep them.
Okay.
Right.
Ed Zuercher, city manager, city of Phoenix. What are we, the 5th largest city in the...
We're somewhere between 5 and 6. We're always...
It's
we're
us
always,
and Philly,
Us and
right?
Philly, you got
Okay,
it.
back with Ed Zuercher in a minute on Newsmaker Sunday. Phoenix City Manager Ed Zuercher is our guest on Newsmaker Sunday. You've been on the job for about 18 months. You oversee some 14,000 city employees. It's a big company,
Yes.
basically is
Yes.
what it is. Let's roll video of former Chief Danny Garcia. One of the first things, not first thing, but one of your big moments, I guess, early on in your tenure was to deal with Chief Garcia when he went, I guess, rogue in your view. He went out and held a press conference about what was going on, and you didn't like it, and you guys parted company. What's the situation now with police in terms of the union, the tension, all of that? You've got Joe Yonner in there. Joe's been on the program.
Yeah. Joe's doing a great job. You know, Chief Garcia, a good man, but he defied a direct order, and we can't have that. That's not acceptable in a system where civilians oversee sworn services. There has to be a chain of command. It wasn't followed. There was a consequence for that. Joe Yonner's done a great job. He's come in. He's, he came up through the ranks. He's a 30-plus year veteran. He's done every job there is in the police department, from officer all the way through. And so I think he has a real trust of the department, that he knows their experience, he believes in what they do, and he can relate to them.
He's
and
only got a year and a half, though,
he has
right?
a little more than a year before
What do
he
you do?
leaves.
Do you start the search before that comes up?
Yeah.
Will there be a nationwide search, or do you
Yes.
suspect, given the Garcia, Chief Garcia was the first outside of the department brought in as chief. He came in from Dallas, where
Right.
he was an assistant. From that experience, does that lead you to believe that it will be from within?
I think what that experience shows is you have to be really careful if you bring someone in from the outside. Not that you should never bring in from the outside, because we can always benefit from getting outside input. But you have to be really careful for the fit and the culture of the organization, that you have the right combination of pushing and pulling and driving and listening. And so we actually have the luxury, knowing that Chief Yonner is going to be leaving us in about a year, we have the luxury of being able to take a slow approach to recruiting and looking and listening to the community first and foremost.
Okay.
Is, what does the community want in a police chief? What do our troops want in a police chief? What do we need in a police chief? And then go finding that person.
We got 1 minute left. You got a big vote, transportation, coming up, what, August?
In August.
Why do we hold these city elections in August? It strikes me that it's not a great way to get great turnout and get the public really involved in these kind of important decisions.
Well, the Phoenix City Charter establishes that we have our elections in the odd-numbered years, and the state has identified 4 times a year when you can have your elections. August is the primary and November is the general. So we have to hold that in August in case there's a runoff that has to be held in November.
So it's part of the reason.
It's part of the reason. But you asked about transportation, very important for us to have, you said, you know, we're talking about we're either the 5th or 6th largest city, we're a big city. And big cities live and die on good quality transportation, which is a variety of things: streets, buses, bikes, transit, trains, everything is all part of it.
30 seconds. What is the thing you've learned the most here in the main job? You've been at this 22 years, but not in this job. You've had the big job for 18 months. What have you learned?
Well, I've learned that people know who I am when I go to the grocery store because they watch shows like this. But what I really learned, the people of Phoenix really love their city government. They love what we do. I've never had someone come and say, do less of that. It's, we need more libraries. We need more parks and police and fire and swimming pools. And so the challenge is, how do we find resources to provide more of the services that they value?
Good to see you, Ed.
John,
Ed
thanks so
Zuercher,
much.
Our guest on Newsmaker Sunday. We'll have you back. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming on. We'll see you next week on Newsmaker Sunday.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and get all the best videos from Fox 10.